Welcome back to Business Ethics. I'm Tom, and today we are talking about consequentialism, right? So, consequentialism is one of the three main ethical theories that we will discuss in this course, right? There's consequentialism, deontology, and virtue ethics, right? Consequentialism is very basically the idea that the consequences of an action determine its moral worth, right? And usually, if your consequences are such that they basically increase pleasure or happiness, then that action is right, right? And if that action has consequences that, you know, um, produce harm or diminish overall happiness, then that action is wrong. That's the basic idea, right? The particular form of consequentialism we will focus on is John Stuart Mill's utilitarianism, right? So utilitarianism is a kind of brand of consequentialism, and it's maybe the most popular brand. So it's kind of like Kleenex or Q-tips, right? We will use it synonymously with the idea of consequentialism because it's the only brand of consequentialism we'll consider, right? The reason why Mill uses this term utilitarianism is because he's thinking about actions being right insofar as they maximize utility or they maximize their usefulness, right? But overall, the idea is that consequentialism really focuses on these consequences, and that's really what determines what is right and what is wrong, right? Mill's actual principle that he uses, and that's in the beginning of the reading, is what he calls his greatest happiness principle. Okay. And the greatest happiness principle is that actions are right in that they tend to promote happiness, wrong in that they tend to promote the reverse, right? And the way Mill's paper kind of functions is that he gives this principle and then he spends the rest of the paper kind of like justifying this principle and putting certain caveats on this. And our lecture video is going to kind of follow a similar kind of path, right? So that is the greatest happiness principle. The actions are right in that they tend to promote happiness, right? And wrong in that they tend to promote the reverse. He just says the reverse or the opposite on purpose, right? Because the opposite of happiness can really amount to lots of different things. It can be sadness, it can be depression, it can be suffering, it can be unhappiness. It can be, sadness, different things, and these all have a different kind of connotation for us. So it just means overall the lack of happiness, right? Now, the way in which I like to really kind of articulate what he's got going on with this principle and why it's substantial is to compare Mill to hedonism, right? Now, hedonism, right, is, if people are familiar, you say someone is very hedonistic if they are very focused on pleasures, right? And there are, you could say, two kinds of hedonism, right, or two senses at least, right? One is kind of the idea of like, a very individualized, focused, pleasure-centered kind of existence, right? This is very much like kind of sex, drugs, and rock and roll kind of existence. If it feels good, do it. You only have one life, this kind of thing, and you just do whatever makes you feel good all the time, right? Because it's going to make you happy. That's one way to think about hedonism, right? Another way is in more of a philosophical sense, which is the idea that hedonism is, in general, the idea that humans live a pleasure-centered life, or a life kind of that centers around the pursuit of happiness, right? And this does not necessarily commit someone to kind of promoting only individual happiness, right? And it's the second sense that really Mill's going to focus on. You might call this like enlightened hedonism, something like this. And this is kind of like the general idea that, human beings are always pursuing happiness and pleasure. But they do so with various caveats, right? There's a difference between what makes you feel good now and what will kind of overall make you happy or satisfied as a person, right? Um, so Mill's going to kind of separate himself from this kind of other hedonism, this kind of individualistic, kind of brute hedonism. And there are two main moves that he makes, right? The first one that I really like to focus on is this distinction between higher and lower pleasures, right? Mill distinguishes between what he calls lower pleasures, which are very animalistic, individualistic pleasures, things like food, sex, you know, drugs, alcohol, the things that make you feel good right now, right? He distinguishes those as being kind of, those are lower pleasures, right? Those are animalistic. Those are the things that we share with the brutes. This is the kind of the way he'll talk about it. He thinks that these pleasures are not as valuable as what he calls higher pleasures. Higher pleasures are pleasures that are distinct of rational beings, right? So think about it this way. You need to use reason to really enjoy those pleasures, right? So things like reading literature, even watching TV, right? We might think that is more kind of base, but really that requires the use of reason, right? If you can't follow a storyline, you're not going to enjoy a drama or something like this, a movie or a series, right? But also art and philosophy and education and all these kinds of things, right? Those are all things that you really have to use reason to enjoy, right? You have to be an intellectual kind of being in order to enjoy those things. And Mill thinks that those kind of pleasures weigh heavier than the lower pleasures, right? I think the line that he uses is that it's better to be an unsatisfied Socrates than a satisfied pig or something like this, right? And the idea is that a lot of lower pleasures only amounts to very little higher pleasure, right? And then of course there are in between. I already mentioned something like watching, binge watching TV or something like this. Also like video games, social media, these kinds of things. Technically, they require rationality. So I think it's somewhat up in the air where this would fit for Mill, but I do think that he's kind of committed to putting those into the realm of higher pleasures. But it's something just to think about, right? But putting an emphasis on higher pleasures separates him from this hedonistic picture, right? Or the kind of brute hedonism that we mentioned. The second thing, which is probably the most important for really understanding consequentialism in general and Mill's utilitarianism, is that he's concerned with the greater good. So he's concerned when he talks about promoting happiness, he means the happiness of everyone, not just my happiness, not just the individual's happiness, right? Consequentialism is really the paradigm of the greater good, right? So people think that you're making sacrifices for the greater good, whether it's being a doctor or going to war or raising a family or whatever it is. That is consequentialism, right? When you're thinking about everyone's happiness, right? This really is the crux of consequentialism, right? So if we go back to the greatest happiness principle, right, it's the idea that actions are right insofar as they tend to promote everyone's happiness, right, and wrong insofar as they tend to promote the opposite. So what if what you do, your action, promotes more happiness overall to everyone involved, then it kind of results in suffering, then it's right? It can result in suffering, right? Just like we think of someone making, individual sacrifices for the greater good, right? It's not to say that there's no pain or no unhappiness. It's just to say that the overall happiness outweighs kind of the bad consequences, right? And the way in which you kind of figure out kind of gray area cases is by using what's known as a utilitarian calculus, right? And I have a handout in this module about how to do this, and it's basically the idea that you would consider a situation, you would list all the people, individuals, entities that are involved, and you would kind of assign them all kind of happiness points, right? You would quantify their happiness, and you would adjust it to kind of consider the situation. And then you would consider how the action in question will impact everyone's happiness, right? Some people's happiness will go down, some people's happiness will go up, right? And then based on this, you kind of add it all up, right? And think about before the action happened and the overall happiness, the amount of happiness points. And then you think about after the action, the consequences of it and the overall happiness. And if that number, that second number, the results, makes the overall happiness go up, then it's right. If it makes the overall happiness go down, then it's wrong, right? So for Mill, right, this all has to do with promoting the greater good, right? Some people's happiness can go down, but if the overall number goes up, then it's right, right? And some concrete examples of this, are things like, we already mentioned war, right? People die in war, but the idea is that those sacrifices are for the greater good, right? That the results will be better than those immediate consequences, right? The long-term consequences, right? But also in kind of more mundane considerations, right? This aligns with a lot of common sense morality, right? We might think stealing is wrong. Me to steal, I don't know, a candy bar from a store is wrong because it only provides me very minimal pleasure, but it creates all kinds of problems for the people who work there and all kinds of supply chain. I don't know what it is, right? But the idea is that the overall consequences are bad, right, or are negative, right? Bring down everyone's happiness, right? And so this is the paradigm of consequentialism, right? And notice I also want to mention how much this really relates to business, right? It's very hard to make the case that we don't run through some kind of pros and cons list when we're considering whether or not we ought to do some kind of thing, right? And definitely in business, right, we are weighing the pros and cons of a decision, right? If we want to change suppliers, we're weighing how this is going to look and what kind of risks are involved, what's the risk reward kind of ratio there. If we're thinking about whether or not to kind of lean into some kind of social cause or engage in some kind of philanthropic pursuit, we are doing some kind of calculus to kind of figure out how this is going to balance out and if it's going to kind of promote the overall kind of success of the business, right? The more kind of technical way in which you might think a utilitarian calculus fits into business is in what we'll talk about is a stakeholder orientation, right? Stakeholders are just anyone that has a stake in a company, right? And oftentimes when you're making a decision, one that might be controversial, you want to consider how it's going to impact the interests of all the stakeholders that are relevant to that situation, right? In essence, you're kind of weighing their happiness and how your action is going to meet their interests or how it's going to not, right? Or whether or not it will actually kind of aggravate those stakeholders and stuff like that. So you can really kind of make a comparison between a utilitarian calculus and a stakeholder orientation, right? And this is something that we'll talk about in more detail. Lastly, I will just mention that one kind of feature of consequentialism is that it only considers the consequences, right? It doesn't matter if your intentions are good, right? It matters the results of your action. So this ends up being a big commitment and actually can lead to all kinds of the endorsement of all kinds of actions we might think are wrong, right? Someone, having bad intentions and doing something kind of horrible, but it has good results, right? Those kinds of things are issues for consequentialism, and we'll talk about that more, especially when we juxtapose this against deontology. So we will talk about this all more. Thank you for watching, and we will talk soon.